She sat upright, composed but fierce, eyes steady and voice sharp. From the first word she spoke, it was clear she hadn't come to play defense. She came prepared. Prepared not just with facts, but with fire, the kind that's been simmering in the hearts of millions of Americans tired of being misled, talked down to, and dismissed. The studio lights shone bright, but not as brightly as the confidence radiating from her as she took center stage. The moment the topic shifted to national integrity and the abuse of public trust, she pounced. There was no hesitation, no political niceties. With surgical precision, she cut through the fog of deflection and doublespeak that had dominated the discussion. Her tone was calm, but her words were lethal. This wasn't the kind of surface-level critique people were used to. She didn't deal in vague accusations or empty rhetoric. She brought the receipts. She cited the press conferences, the televised speeches, the endless declarations made in the name of national security, all meant to justify a narrative that never held water. She pointed out how every major claim, repeated endlessly for years, had crumbled under the weight of evidence. She reminded the audience how institutions and individuals had been dragged through the mud based on nothing more than innuendo and political ambition masquerading as justice. The moderators didn't interrupt. They couldn't. The force of her presence, the clarity of her message demanded silence. Her words weren't just argument, they were indictment. She listed one deception after another, each one tied not to hearsay but to direct quotes and documented contradictions. There was no escape hatch, no clever spin that could dilute the gravity of what she was laying bare. She described how the country had been held hostage by a narrative crafted in back rooms and sold with solemn faces to the American people. How dissent was mocked, questions were silenced, and anyone who dared to challenge the narrative was branded unpatriotic or worse. But now, here she was, turning the lights on, exposing what had always been there but rarely confronted so directly, so unapologetically and with such passion. And she wasn't speaking for herself. That was obvious. She was channeling every small business owner who struggled under the weight of overreach, every parent who watched school board meetings turn into ideological battlegrounds, every soldier and veteran who wondered if the sacrifices they made were being manipulated for political gain. Her voice carried theirs, loud and unwavering. She leaned forward, hands folded on the table in front of her, as she outlined the consequences of misinformation peddled not by fringe actors, but by those in positions of enormous trust. She emphasized the broken trust. How it wasn't about political teams or partisan battles. It was about the core idea that the truth still mattered. That accountability wasn't just a talking point, it was a necessity. What made it more powerful was the restraint she showed. No yelling, no name-calling, just a relentless stream of irrefutable facts, each one landing harder than the last. She let the truth do the damage, and damage it did. The air in the studio got noticeably heavier. The camera caught the subtle reactions, a producer shifting uncomfortably, a guest blinking rapidly, even a panelist who had nodded confidently, moments earlier now staring blankly ahead. She quoted from hearings, official transcripts, and news headlines that had aged poorly. She highlighted contradictions, moments of grandstanding that time had rendered hollow. And she did it all with that unmistakable calm, not the calm of someone unsure of her ground, but the kind that comes from knowing the facts are not just on your side, they are your side. And as she spoke, people began to lean in. Not just those in the studio, but the viewers at home. Ordinary citizens who might not follow politics day to day, but know when someone's finally saying what needs to be said. She gave them a voice. Not with anger, but with righteous clarity. Every sentence sharpened the divide between truth and spin. She didn't just dismantle arguments, she made it clear there had never been a foundation to stand on in the first place. The broadcast was supposed to be a routine political discussion. A panel of experts, a few talking points, and a safe back-and-forth exchange to fill airtime. But the moment she began to speak, everything changed. The tone shifted. The room quieted. The cameras, the audience, even the host seemed to feel something different was about to unfold. It wasn't just a conversation anymore, it was a reckoning. She didn't raise her voice, She didn't need to. Her delivery was measured, deliberate, and devastating. With the poise of a prosecutor and the conviction of someone who had done her homework, she began to lay out the case. It wasn't a barrage of emotional rhetoric. It was a methodical unveiling of facts, timelines, and public records that built towards something undeniable. Step by step, she traced the story the public had been told for years. A grand tale, repeated endlessly across headlines, speeches, and interviews, designed to paint a picture that had never actually materialized. With every point she made, she peeled back another layer of that story, showing how selective leaks, rehearsed sound bites, and closed-door maneuvering had built a house of cards presented as ironclad truth. The other panelists watched her closely. Some shuffled their notes as if trying to find a defense. Others sat still, no longer interested in jumping in. No one wanted to interrupt a takedown this surgical. She didn't accuse without evidence. She brought the evidence first, and then allowed the implication to speak for itself. The way she laid it out, it was impossible not to see it. A pattern of manipulation, strategic silence, and a misuse of authority that went deeper than anyone had been willing to admit. She spoke with a clarity that was hard to ignore, recounting how intelligence briefings had been mischaracterized in public, how statements made under oath had contradicted those made in press conferences, how media outlets had breathlessly run with narratives fed to them by insiders with agendas. She cited exact dates, reports, and inconsistencies that couldn't be waved away with generalizations. And what made it so impactful was her tone. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. Disappointed in how truth had been weaponized, how trust in institutions had been exploited, how the American people had been dragged along for a ride they never consented to, all in the name of political, theater disguised as national security. As she continued, the atmosphere inside the studio became more tense. Not because she was being confrontational, but because her words were exposing a deep discomfort, one that had been buried under spin for far too long. The silence between her sentences grew heavier. You could sense the production team behind, the cameras trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let it ride. They let it ride. She used terms like selective transparency and manufactured suspicion, explaining how those in power had become adept at raising just enough doubt to divide the public without ever producing the full picture. She described the damage done, not just to reputations, but to faith in the very systems meant to protect democracy. It wasn't just political gamesmanship, she said. It was erosion of trust, of unity, of the principle that facts should matter more than narrative. She leaned into the idea that when leaders cry wolf for years, they make it harder to respond when a real threat comes. That undermining public confidence for political gain doesn't just hurt opponents, it weakens the nation, and she made it personal. Not about party lines, but about everyday citizens. People who had watched these spectacles unfold, who had been told to sit down, shut up, and trust that those in charge knew better. That's what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't just a fact check. It wasn't just a response. It was a mirror held up to an entire chapter of political life that had been carefully choreographed to avoid accountability. She didn't need applause. She didn't need to raise her voice. She brought the receipts, laid them out on the table, and simply asked the question, what do we do when the people we're supposed to trust abuse that trust? No one had a good answer. And in that silence, from the moment she began speaking, the atmosphere in the studio changed. At first, the other guests maintained their composure, still confident in their talking points and prepared sound bites. But something about her presence, the clarity in her tone, the steadiness in her delivery, began to shift the energy in the room. This wasn't going to be a typical back-and-forth debate. Everyone could feel it. She was calm, almost disarmingly so. But each time she spoke, her words struck with precision. She didn't rely on flashy rhetoric or theatrical emotion. Instead, she calmly dismantled each point with verifiable facts, clear logic, and a sense of conviction that couldn't be faked. With every sentence, she pulled back the curtain on what had long been accepted as untouchable. She wasn't aggressive, but she was undeniable. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was something surgical about it, something that made even the most polished panelists pause before responding. As the minutes ticked by, you could see it happening in real time. The confident smirks fading, the eyes darting to the host for backup that never came, the occasional clearing of the throat to mask the rising discomfort. They were being outmaneuvered on live television. The camera captured it all, every shift in posture, every awkward glance. Even the host, who had started the segment with the usual professional enthusiasm, was visibly thrown off balance. She tried to maintain the flow, but there was no containing the moment. The conversation had stopped being a discussion and had become something much more raw, much more real. And then the murmurs started, just faint at first, a ripple from the studio audience. A soft gasp here, a low murmur there, the kind of reaction that only happens when people know they're witnessing something unscripted, something genuine. Viewers could feel it, even through the screen. They weren't watching a carefully choreographed exchange of political jabs. They were watching someone tell the truth in a place that rarely tolerates it. She began referencing dates, transcripts, moments that most had conveniently forgotten. Her arguments weren't built on opinions. They were supported by a meticulous chain of facts. She didn't just poke holes in opposing narratives. She tore them down completely, revealing how each layer had been crafted more for public theater than public service. The panelists had no answer, and when they tried, it only made things worse. They stumbled through talking points, repeated half-formed thoughts, and at times simply stared blankly, unable to recover from the blow that had just landed. What followed was a kind of collective realization. People in the studio began to react, some with nods of approval, others with visible disbelief. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unprepared for the level of truth being laid out in such plain language. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was powerful precisely because it was so quiet, so composed, so irrefutable. Social media lit up instantly. Clips of the exchange began circulating before the segment even ended. Viewers weren't just engaged, they were electrified. Comment sections exploded with reactions. Did she really just say that? Finally, someone said it out loud. I've never seen anyone shut them down like this. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural moment. Meanwhile, the individual on the receiving end of her dismantling sat still, trying to maintain composure but unable to hide the redness creeping up his neck. He adjusted his notes. He forced a smile. He attempted a weak rebuttal that only served to highlight how badly the momentum had turned. No one was listening anymore. Not to him. The audience was captivated by her. She hadn't come to play the usual political games. She hadn't come to hedge or soften the truth. She came armed with facts, backed by conviction, and fueled by the weight of something that's been missing from public discourse for too long: honesty. Not manufactured outrage, not hollow platitudes, but real, unfiltered truth. And in that moment, it didn't matter what side anyone was on. Everyone watching knew one thing for certain: something rare had just happened. As the discussion neared its end, the tension in the studio was almost tangible. The host was trying to wrap things up, looking for a clean transition to the next segment, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. Her eyes remained fixed, her voice calm and unwavering. For nearly an hour, she had countered every point thrown her way with facts, timelines, and direct quotes. She had been graceful, assertive, and brutally honest, but everyone watching could feel it. She was saving something. Then came the moment. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't embellished. There was no dramatic pause or sweeping gesture, just a single sentence delivered with quiet authority, like a final piece of evidence dropped on the table that no one could deny. The studio, filled, with lights, movement, and chatter just moments before, fell completely silent. Not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because no one knew how to respond. That single line sliced through the air like a blade. It wasn't angry, it wasn't personal, it was just true. And that made it all the more devastating. The reaction was instant and involuntary. One of the panelists actually blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard. The host, who had maintained a veneer of professionalism throughout the segment, gave a subtle side glance as if unsure whether to intervene or let the moment breathe. The control room didn't cut to commercial. The camera stayed on her, capturing the quiet fire in her eyes. It wasn't just what she said, it was what it meant. The words carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from moral clarity. Not partisan bravado or political calculation, but the heavy, undeniable truth that hits harder the more it's denied. She hadn't spent the hour just debating issues or batting around opinions. She had laid out a sequence of failures, of broken trust, of consequences that real people had lived through. And then, in that one final line, she condensed it all into a single, powerful statement that held nothing back. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was stunned. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone in the room understands they've just heard something they weren't prepared for, but absolutely needed to hear. The usual defenses were gone. The talking points that might have seemed clever 20 minutes earlier now sounded hollow in comparison. She hadn't just won the exchange, she had revealed the entire game for what it was. Online, the reaction was just as immediate. Within seconds, clips of her final statement were everywhere, shared, reposted, replayed. People weren't just watching. They were reacting. Not with partisan outrage or tribal cheering, but with something deeper. Recognition. They knew she had spoken something real, something bold. Something too many others were afraid to say. Even those who disagreed with her on other issues were forced to admit that she had struck a nerve. That kind of honesty, especially in a media landscape built on image and spin, is rare. And when it happens, people don't forget it. That moment, that line, became the headline. Not because it was crafted for attention, but because it carried the kind of weight that reshapes conversations. She didn't smile when she said it. She didn't gloat after. She just sat back, her point made, letting the silence speak for itself. And it did, louder than any applause or rebuttal ever could. Some moments in media are staged. This wasn't one of them. This was spontaneous, unfiltered, and entirely authentic. It was the culmination of everything she had argued, every contradiction, exposed, every illusion dismantled, summed up in one last haunting truth that couldn't be spun or softened. For those watching at home, it felt like a release. Like someone had finally stood in front of the noise and cut through it with something real. Not politically correct, not carefully worded, but real. And in a world where so many voices compete to say so little, that kind of clarity is unforgettable. As the broadcast came to a close, the air still carried the echo of her words. No grand gesture was needed. Her presence, her clarity, and the truth she delivered had done the work. The usual sign-off felt almost hollow after what had just unfolded. Viewers at home weren't left with the typical feeling of having watched another political skirmish. They were left in quiet reflection, replaying in their minds the way she calmly dismantled falsehoods, called out hypocrisy, and demanded a return to accountability. She hadn't come to score political points. She hadn't come to play the media game. She came to speak for the countless Americans who feel ignored, who have grown tired of watching powerful people bend the truth with no consequence. And she did so not with anger, but with courage. It was the kind of moment that reminded people what leadership looks like. Not flashy, not performative, but rooted in principle and unwavering in purpose. The days that followed saw her name trending, not because she courted the spotlight, but because she had done what so few dare to do in public life, tell the truth plainly and without apology. Editorials scrambled to respond, but none could erase the clarity of her performance. Even her critics were forced to admit she had controlled the moment, reshaped the narrative, and done it all without compromising her values. In the end, the debate wasn't remembered for its usual political posturing. It was remembered for the moment someone stood up, not with a slogan but with substance. In an era dominated by noise, her voice cut through like a blade, sharp and unshakable. She reminded the nation that truth still matters, that integrity still resonates, and that one voice, when armed with facts and conviction, can still shake the foundations of even the most protected falsehoods. It wasn't just a win in a political sense. It was a cultural moment, the kind that inspires conversations around dinner tables, in classrooms, and across communities. The kind that gives people hope that not everyone in public life has forgotten who they serve. She didn't just leave a mark. She set a standard. As the lights dimmed and the camera faded to black, she didn't need a standing ovation. The silence spoke louder. It was the silence of stunned acknowledgement, of undeniable truth landing with full weight. She walked off the set not as a politician spinning a message, but as a truth teller whose words would echo far beyond the studio walls. Because in the end, when everything else fades, polls, headlines, applause, what remains is the truth. And she made sure it could